The paper in Adelaide Holloway's hand was shaking, and not from the wind that swept through the open barn door. Clark Keller stood 6 feet away from her, upright for the first time in 4 months, his shoulder healed, his jaw set, and his eyes carrying something she had never seen in them before, something that looked terrifyingly close to shame. "You're taking it back," she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. It came out like the words had been scraped across gravel before they reached the air between them. Clark didn't deny it. He stood there in the pale October light of 1882, hat in his hands, the Keller ranch sprawling behind him like a kingdom neither of them had asked to be standing in the middle of. "Adelaide, don't." She held up one hand, the paper still trembling between her fingers. It was the ledger summary, the one she had spent 3 nights drafting by lamplight, showing him exactly what she had done with his land, his cattle, his broken fences and unpaid debts. The one that showed a profit margin that hadn't existed here in 7 years. "Don't apologize, don't explain, just answer me one thing." He met her eyes. "Was this always temporary?" she asked. "Did you hire me knowing you'd walk back in here and make me invisible the moment you could stand on your own 2 feet?" The silence that followed was the most damning thing Adelaide Holloway had ever heard in her 28 years of living. It stretched across the barn like a rope pulled too tight, and she felt something inside her chest crack along with it. She had built something here. She had poured herself into this land, these animals, these people who worked the ranch, until the Keller land breathed again. And now the man who owned all of it was standing in front of her, healed, and he was afraid. Not of her, of what she had become, of what she had made this place into without him. Of the fact that he no longer knew where he fit. She turned to leave. Her boots hit the dirt floor of the barn with a sound like punctuation, like a full stop at the end of something beautiful. "Adelaide." His voice cracked on her name. She stopped, but she didn't turn around. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "Need someone." She turned around then slowly and looked at him. Clark Keller, 34 years old, sun-darkened skin, and a jaw that hadn't been clean-shaved since before the accident. Standing in the middle of the barn he had grown up in, looking for all the world like a man who had just realized he'd already lost something he never knew he wanted. And that was the moment she decided not to walk away. Not yet. The beginning of all of this, had been nothing like what she would have expected. She had arrived in Dust Creek, Montana in the first week of June, 1882, on the back of a westbound train that smelled of coal smoke and cattle, and the particular desperation of people who were going somewhere new because somewhere old had nothing left for them. Adelaide had packed everything she owned into a single trunk that had belonged to her mother. A set of good working clothes, 2 dresses for occasions that probably wouldn't come, a worn copy of a farming almanac, a ledger book her father had given her when she was 16 and already keeping the accounts for his modest Illinois farm, and a letter of recommendation from a man named Garrison Prout, who had employed her for 4 years as the de facto manager of his grain and livestock operation outside of Springfield before his son came of age and politely made her redundant. The advertisement she had answered had been sparse. Help needed at working cattle ranch, Montana Territory. Experience with livestock and land management essential. Temporary position. Inquire Keller Ranch, Dust Creek. Temporary. She had underlined the word with her fingernail as she read it on the train and told herself that temporary was fine. Temporary paid. Temporary meant she was moving forward rather than standing still in the crumbling farmhouse outside Springfield, where her father had died 2 springs ago, leaving her with a paid debt but no land and no prospects, and a whole country of people who found it eccentric at best that a woman would want to do work that men did. Adelaide was not eccentric. She was simply capable, and she had long since stopped apologizing for it. The wagon that met her at the Dust Creek station had been driven by a ranch hand named Denny, who was approximately 17 years old, sunburned to the color of old brick, and deeply uncertain about what to make of her. "You're the one answering the ad," he said, eyeing her trunk. "I am," she said, and climbed onto the wagon bench without waiting for him to offer a hand. Denny drove her out to the Keller ranch without much conversation, which suited her fine. She spent the 20-minute ride studying the landscape. It was stunning in the way that things are when they are both enormous and indifferent to you. Rolling grass that went gold at the tips in the summer heat, mountains stacked up against the western horizon like they'd been piled there by a careless god, and in the middle of it all, a ranch that had clearly once been proud and was now in the early stages of looking sorry for itself. The fencing along the south road was patched with wire that didn't match. The access road had ruts deep enough to swallow a wagon wheel. The house itself was a solid, handsome structure. 2 stories of pine and stone, with a wide covered porch that wrapped around the front and eastern side. It had been built by someone who meant it to last, but it had the look of a place that had been running on stubbornness rather than attention for a while. Denny pulled up and hopped down and said, in the manner of someone delivering news he wasn't sure about, "Mr. Keller's inside. He can't come out to meet you." "I was told as much," Adelaide said. "His shoulder, and his ribs, and his head a little. The horse went down bad." Denny pulled her trunk from the wagon with effort. "Doc Reinhardt says he's not to do heavy work for at least 3 months. More like 4 to be safe." She nodded and walked up to the front door and knocked on it with 3 crisp raps, because standing on ceremony felt right when you were about to walk into a stranger's home and ask them to trust you with everything they had. Clark Keller answered his own door, which she later understood was a point of pride he couldn't abandon even in his current state. He looked terrible. That was the honest truth of it. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that men who work outdoors tend to be, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of slate that were ringed with the particular gray of someone who hadn't been sleeping enough. His right arm was held against his body in a way that told her his shoulder was worse than the advertisement had implied. He had the look of a man who was furious about his own body. "Adelaide Holloway," he said. "That's correct," she said. He studied her for one long moment. She was used to this. Men looked at her and calculated. She was a woman who appeared at first glance to be something soft, with dark red hair and a face that her mother had called pretty and her father had called sensible. It took people a moment to recalibrate when she opened her mouth or walked into a room with a purpose. "You ran livestock before?" he asked. "Cattle and grain, 4 years. Before that, my father's farm for 6 years after my mother passed. Shorthorn cattle, pigs, chickens, wheat. You keep accounts. I have ledgers with me if you want to review my methods." Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not approval exactly. More like the cautious relief of a man who had expected a problem and found something else instead. "Come in," he said. The first 2 weeks were the hardest, not because the work was beyond her. The work was exactly what she was built for. The ranch ran 900 acres in prime grazing land, with a herd of roughly 240 cattle, and the kind of steady labor force that had gone a little slack without firm direction. Denny, she quickly established, was hardworking and eager and needed only clear instruction to be useful. There were 3 other hands, older men named Holt, Rafe, and a quiet, methodical older man who went by Gus, who had worked the Keller land for 12 years and regarded Adelaide with the polite skepticism of someone who was going to take his time before deciding what he thought of her. What was hard was the negotiations. Not with the men, though those took careful navigation. The hard part was the daily briefings with Clark Keller, who was confined to the house, to the parlor and the ground floor bedroom, by doctor's orders and the grinding humiliation of needing to be still when his whole life had been motion. He was in pain more often than he admitted. He was also in a state of controlled fury about the condition of his ranch that she had to learn to distinguish from anger at her. On the 3rd day, she sat across from him at the parlor table with a map of the property and laid out what she had found. "Your eastern fence line is compromised across about 1.5 miles, she said. "Your south herd has been grazing too close to the creek because of it, and 2 of your steers show early signs of waterborne ailment that could spread if they're not separated and treated." He stared at the map. "I knew about the fence." "The fence is the smaller problem," she said. "The bigger problem is that you owe Hartwell's Supply in Dust Creek 4 months of unpaid account. They've been generous with you because your family has traded with them for 30 years, but the current figure is substantial enough that Mr. Hartwell is going to have to make a business decision about it soon, and when he does, he'll stop your account, and then you'll lose your ability to order the feed you need for winter." Clark looked up from the map. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Denny drove me into town for supplies on Tuesday. I introduced myself to Mr. Hartwell as your new manager and asked him to give me a full accounting of your outstanding obligations." The silence was careful. "You could have asked me," he said. "I did," she replied. "You told me to handle the day-to-day. I meant the cattle. The cattle depend on the account, which depends on the debt, which depends on cash flow, which I cannot manage without knowing the full picture." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not doing this to overstep. I'm doing it because I can't do the job halfway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The Holly's cattle buyer is due in Dust Creek in 2 weeks. I'd planned to sell off 15 head from the East herd to cover some of it. 17 head would cover the Hartwell account and leave enough for the winter supply run," she said. "And I've been looking at your breed stock. You have 3 heifers that aren't pulling their weight as breeding animals. Including them in the sale would make your remaining herd leaner and stronger." He didn't answer immediately. She could see him wrestling with something, and she let him wrestle. "All right," he finally said, "but I want to review the sale numbers before you finalize anything." "Of course," she said. She gathered her papers and stood up. Then she paused. "Mr. Keller, I understand this is difficult." "Do you?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. "You've run this land since your father passed it to you. You built something here. Now you're sitting inside while someone else touches it. Yes, I think I understand that." His jaw tightened. But something in his eyes shifted again, that small, reluctant recalibration she was beginning to recognize. "You can call me Clark," he said. She nodded. "Adelaide," she offered, and left the parlor. The cattle sale went well. She negotiated with Holly's herself because Clark was not yet well enough to make the trip to town, and because she had, in her 4 years with Garrison Prout, learned exactly how these conversations went. Holly's was a compact, weathered man who initially spoke past her, addressing his remarks to Denny, which Adelaide found mildly amusing rather than irritating, because she had long understood that the best way to handle this particular form of blindness was to simply be better at the job than anyone expected. She had the final figures settled in 30 minutes, including a price per head that was $6 above what Holly's typically offered, because she had spent 3 evenings before the meeting learning the current beef market rates from the regional newspapers that Gus kept in a pile in the bunkhouse and had no idea were valuable. She brought the written agreement back to Clark that evening. He read it twice. $6 over market, he said. $7 over what you've been selling at for the past 2 years, she said. According to your ledger, you've been under negotiating. He looked up. My ledger, you've read my ledger. You gave me access to the house records. I gave you access to the supply lists. The ledger was in the same drawer. He held her gaze. Then something shifted in his expression that she hadn't seen yet, something that might have been, under different circumstances, the beginning of a smile. "You're going to be relentless about this, aren't you? About doing the job well?" "Yes," she said. He handed the agreement back to her. "Well done," he said, quietly enough that it didn't feel like it was costing him too much to say it. It cost him something, though. She could see that, and she filed the knowledge away without comment. July turned the Montana landscape into something almost violent in its beauty. The grass went gold and the sky went enormous, and the cattle grew sleek on good summer grazing, because Adelaide had moved the east herd back to the upper pasture, once Denny and Rafe had repaired the fencing over 2 weeks of hard work. She was up before dawn every morning, and she was the last one to set her lamp down at night. She kept meticulous daily records of the herd, the grazing rotation, the condition of the fencing and the water sources, and a running account of every dollar that moved in or out of the ranch's operation. She had found, in Clark's desk with his distracted permission, a backlog of paperwork that had been ignored for months, and she worked through it methodically, negotiating a payment arrangement with Hartwell that satisfied him and didn't cripple the ranch's operating cash, and establishing a credit account with a second supplier in the next town over as a contingency. She also hired, against some internal resistance from Holt that she addressed directly and without drama, a local man named Samuel Bridger, who was half Crow on his mother's side and had grown up in this particular stretch of Montana. Samuel knew the land in a way that the other hands didn't, knew where the water ran underground in dry years and where the north fence was most likely to fail in winter weather. He worked quietly and with enormous competence, and within 2 weeks even Holt had stopped grumbling about the hire. Clark had initially questioned the addition. "I can't afford another wage," he'd said. "You can't afford not to have him," she'd replied. "Your north herd would have drifted into the Massey property last Tuesday if he hadn't anticipated the gap in the fence before it happened. The Masseys are not friendly about strays." "I know that," Clark said. "I grew up next to the Masseys." "Then you know what it would have cost you. Samuel's wage for a month costs less than a legal dispute over trespassing cattle." He had looked at her from his chair by the window, where he spent his mornings reviewing the accounts she brought him and watching the ranch move around him without him. The look was complex, part reluctant agreement, part something else she was only beginning to learn to read in him. "Fine," he said. "I've already brought him on," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She was learning him, too. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated, the thing that complicated the clean professional purpose she had arrived with. She was learning Clark Keller the way you learn land, slowly and through close attention, finding the contours of his character in the details of how he responded to things. He was private in the way that men often are when they have been hurt, and have decided that vulnerability is something to be managed rather than expressed. He was proud, but not petty. He had been fair with his men, she could tell that from the way they spoke about him when he wasn't there, fair and demanding in equal measure, which was the combination that made people work hard and stay. He asked her questions, more as the weeks passed. Not just about the ranch, though those questions were constant and often detailed. He asked her once how she had learned to negotiate, and she told him about Garrison Prout and the grain buyers who had initially dismissed her, until she showed up 3 sales running with better numbers than anyone expected, at which point they stopped dismissing her and started resenting her, which she had found considerably easier to work with. He had laughed at that, a real laugh, not the managed sound she'd heard from him a few times before. It changed his whole face, that laugh. It made him younger and more open and considerably more dangerous to her equilibrium. She filed that away, too. In late July, the doctor came out for a second examination and confirmed that the ribs were healing well and the shoulder was progressing, though slower than hoped. Clark was allowed to walk the grounds now carefully, no lifting and no riding. She found him outside the barn one morning before breakfast, standing in the early light and just looking at the place. She came and stood nearby with her coffee because there was nothing to say, and she understood that. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, which surprised her because she had not expected comfortable silence to be something they were capable of. "My father built the house," he said eventually. "I built the barn. When, 10 years ago, I was 24, took most of a summer." She looked at the barn. It was well built, solid in the way of things made by a person who cared about the outcome. "It shows," she said. He looked at her sideways. "That's a compliment coming from you, isn't it?" "I don't say things I don't mean," she said. "No," he said quietly. "I've noticed that." She sipped her coffee and didn't look at him. The morning light was doing something unreasonable to the mountains, and she focused on that instead of the warmth that was trying to settle somewhere in her chest. By August, the ranch was running more smoothly than it had in years. She knew this partly from the numbers, which were clear. and partly from the way the hands carried themselves, which had the ease of people who knew what they were doing and trusted the person directing them. She had organized a system of weekly rotation for the pasture checks that meant no section went unmonitored for more than 3 days. She had repaired the water trough system on the north side with Gus's help after discovering that a slow leak was causing the cattle in that section to range too far looking for water. She had also, quietly, and with Samuel's guidance, identified the best spots to cut hay for winter storage on the North Meadows, which had been neglected in favor of the more accessible South Meadows for the past several years. The North Meadows produced better hay, taller and richer, and having the additional stores would make the difference between a comfortable winter and a desperate one. Clark reviewed her autumn plan with an expression she was beginning to understand as his focused look, the one where he was taking everything in and processing it, and deciding what he thought, which was different from the resistant look and the reluctant agreement look, and the complicated look that appeared sometimes when they had been talking for a long time, and the conversation had gone somewhere neither of them had quite intended. "The North Meadow cut is good thinking," he said, setting down the plan. "I should have done that 2 years ago." "You were doing other things," she said. "Making a mess of the accounts," he said, with a kind of flat honesty that she respected. "Running a cattle ranch by yourself is not a small undertaking," she said. "I had the men." Having men and having management are different things. You needed someone in the office as much as in the field. He looked up at her. "Is that what you are, the office?" "I am whatever the ranch needs," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that went 1 beat too long and then looked back at the plan. "Right," he said. "Go ahead with the North Meadow." The letter arrived in the second week of August, and it was addressed to her, not Clark, which would not have been remarkable except that no one had her address here, and she had been extremely careful about that. She stood in the kitchen holding the envelope and felt a cold finger trace her spine. It was from a man named Adelaide Holloway, her brother. She had not spoken to Everett in 3 years, since the day he had arrived at their father's farm and informed her that he had, while she was working at Pruitt's, borrowed against the farm's value using a power of attorney he had obtained from their father during the older man's declining health, and that the resulting debt had consumed the property. That was why there was nothing left when their father died. That was why she had packed her trunk and answered an advertisement in a paper. The letter was brief. It informed her that he had heard she was working out west, that he was in difficult circumstances in Illinois, and that he felt family ought to help family. A sum of $50 was mentioned, in passing, as though it were a small and reasonable thing. She stood in the kitchen of Clark Keller's house and read the letter twice, and then folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and went back out to oversee the morning's pasture check. Because she was not going to give Adelaide Holloway the satisfaction of disrupting so much as a single hour of her day. She told Clark about it that evening because she had found that telling him things directly was always better than letting him discover them another way. He listened without interruption, which was one of his better qualities. "He's asking for money," Clark said when she was done. "He's implying he may come looking for it if I don't send it," she said. Clark's expression hardened. "Is that a threat?" "It is shaped like one, yes. He is skilled at things shaped like things." A pause. "Do you have $50 to send him?" She looked at him. "I have my wages, which are mine and which I will choose to spend as I see fit. But no, I will not be sending him $50 or any dollars. What I need to know is whether he is likely to come here and whether, if he does, that causes a problem for you. For me. You hired me. If he arrives making claims about me, it reflects on your judgment." Clark shook his head slowly. "Adelaide, I'm not worried about my reputation when someone's trying to squeeze money from you." The directness of it caught her off guard briefly. She managed to cover it. "I can handle Everett." "I know you can," he said, and from him it wasn't condescension. It was just a statement of observed fact. "But handle him knowing that if he shows up here, he shows up to a working ranch with several men on it who will take their direction from you." She felt something shift in her chest. It was the kind of warmth she had been successfully ignoring for 6 weeks now, and it was becoming harder to manage. She wrote back to Everett that night. She told him clearly that she had no money to spare and no interest in further communication, and that she wished him well in resolving his circumstances by his own means. She mailed it in Dust Creek the next morning before anyone else was fully awake. Everett did not write again. September came in cool and bright, and Clark's shoulder had healed enough that Doc Reinhardt told him he could begin limited physical activity. He was on the ranch grounds daily now, moving through the operation with the careful attention of a man who has been away and is relearning the shape of something beloved. He watched without interfering, which she respected. He asked questions, many of which made her think, because he knew things about this land and these animals that she had learned only from observation, and he had learned from a lifetime. And the combination of his knowledge and her systems was producing something better than either alone. There was an afternoon in the second week of September when they were both in the barn, checking the condition of the new hay stores she'd had brought in from the North Meadow cut. He was moving with more ease than before, the shoulder almost back to normal, and she was recording the inventory when she turned to say something about the south barn section and found him closer than expected. He was looking at her, not at the hay, at her. She held her ground because she was Adelaide Holloway and she had been holding her ground her entire life. "Something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. And then he said nothing else for a moment, and the silence in the barn was the specific kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses on the ears and the chest in equal measure. "I've been thinking," he said finally, about what this place looked like in May." She waited. "And about what it looks like now," he said, "and about how much of that difference is you." She kept her expression neutral. "The men did the physical work. Under your direction, with your planning." He shook his head slightly. "Don't deflect, I'm trying to say something." "Then say it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Thank you," he said. "That's the first part of it." She noted the implication of the first part. "What's the second part?" He seemed to consider how to proceed. "I don't know yet," he said. It was an honest answer. She accepted it and went back to her inventory, but her pen moved less surely than before, and she was glad the lamplight was not quite bright enough to show the color that had risen in her face. October brought the complication. It arrived in the form of a man named Garrett Locke, who rode up the ranch road on a fine chestnut horse and announced himself as a land buyer from Helena, representing a consortium of Eastern investors who were very interested in the Keller property. Clark met him on the porch. Adelaide stood slightly behind and to the side, the way she had learned to position herself when she was listening rather than leading. But Locke had apparently done his research, because after shaking Clark's hand, he turned and looked directly at her and said, "And you must be the woman who's been running this place." "I manage the operation," she said. "My clients have been watching this ranch," Locke said, settling into an easy, corporate smoothness that immediately made her trust him less. "It's impressive what's been done here in the past 4 months. Productivity is up, the herd quality has improved, and from what I understand, the debt position has been significantly improved." He smiled. "You've increased the property's value considerably, Miss Holloway," Clark said. "I'm not selling." "Of course not," Locke said, in the tone of a man who was certain he could change that. "I'm simply here to open a conversation. My clients are prepared to make a very generous offer." He stayed for dinner, because Clark, whatever else he was, understood the economics of refusing to hear an offer before you've heard it. Adelaide sat at the table and listened to Locke's pitch with the patient attention she brought to everything, and what she heard between the lines of the offer was this. The consortium wanted the land, but they wanted it specifically because of what she had done to it. They were, in effect, trying to buy the improvements that her work had created. After dinner, when Locke had retired to the spare room, Clark found her in the kitchen. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that his offer is substantial and that 2 months ago you might have found it worth serious consideration. And now you have a ranch that's operating well and heading into a strong winter position. Selling now would mean selling at the moment it's returned to real value. That seems backward. He leaned against the kitchen doorway. He wants to know what it would take to keep you on if he bought it, she stilled. He mentioned that to you before dinner. Apparently his clients think you're the asset. The word landed strangely. Asset. She was a person. She was also, apparently in certain calculations, a line item. I'm not part of the property, she said. I know that, Clark said, the directness again. The quiet conviction that he did these things without thinking about them, without the performance of being decent. He just was. I told him so. And what did he say? He said he was sure you'd be amenable to the right arrangement. He said that, Adelaide repeated. He did. Clark's jaw had a set to it. I then told him that you were not a piece of furniture and that the conversation was over. She looked at him across the kitchen. He looked back at her. You should still consider the offer, she said, because she was honest even when honesty was complicated. Separately from any arrangement involving me. Adelaide, he said, it is a significant sum. Adelaide, he said again with a patience that was, she thought, going to be the end of her. I'm not selling my father's ranch. All right, she said. And I'm not, he stopped, started again. I'm not reducing you to a negotiating point. You're not something to be offered and counteroffered. The warmth was back, fuller and harder to contain. She turned to the window so he couldn't see her face. Mr. Locke will not take that answer well. Mr. Locke can find somewhere else to spend the night, Clark said. I'll be polite about it in the morning. He was. Locke departed after breakfast with the gracious disappointment of a man who had not given up yet, leaving behind a card and the suggestion that the offer remained open. Adelaide filed the card away and did not expect to hear from him again soon, though she was not entirely certain she was right about that. The day after Locke left was when things shifted again. She was in the south pasture with Samuel, discussing the condition of the winter fence line, when Denny came riding out with an expression that meant news. Dr. Reinhardt says Mr. Keller can start riding again, Denny called. Full recovery. She heard it and felt the earth tilt slightly under her feet. Full recovery, which meant the arrangement, the temporary position, was approaching its natural end. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the first day. She had spent 4 months not thinking about it and thinking about it constantly in equal measure, and now it was here, and she stood in the south pasture of the Keller ranch with her heart doing something unreasonable and her face doing nothing at all. Good news, she said. Samuel looked at her. He was a perceptive man. Yes, he agreed quietly. She rode back to the house that afternoon with the clear intention of telling Clark they needed to discuss next steps. Her timeline, her plans, where she would go after. She walked into the barn and found him there, standing in the pale October light, hat in his hands. And he looked at her like a man who was about to do something he knew was wrong, and in his hands was the ledger summary she had left on the parlor table that morning, and she read the truth of it in his face before he said a word. He was going to tell her he was taking the ranch back. He was going to restore the natural order of things, put himself back at the center and her at the margin, because that was what was supposed to happen, and because he was afraid. She could see the fear in him clearly now, afraid of what she'd become here, afraid of needing her, afraid of what it meant that she had breathed life into this place in a way that nobody, including him, had expected. And so she had said it first. You're taking it back. And he had let the silence condemn him. And she had turned to leave, and he had broken on her name. And she had stopped because she was Adelaide Holloway, and she knew the difference between a man who was wrong and a man who was lost, and Clark Keller was lost, and she had never been able to leave something without at least trying to help it find its way. She stood in the barn doorway and turned around and looked at him. Then learn, she said. He blinked. What? You said you don't know how to need someone. So learn. She crossed her arms, not in defense, in the way she had when she was preparing to be practical. You've been back on your feet for 3 weeks. You've been watching and not doing. That's how you relearn the ranch. Watch and then do. The same applies to this. He stared at her. You're not leaving. I'm not leaving today, she corrected. What happens after today depends on a conversation we haven't had yet. He set down the ledger and ran his hand over his face in the way he did when he was working through something. "What conversation is that?" "The one about what I am here," she said. "Because I am not temporary anymore, Clark, and we both know it. The work I've done is not temporary work. The systems I've built are not stopgap measures. If you take this ranch back and dismantle what I've put in place, it will be worse off in 6 months than it was when I arrived, and you know that too." His jaw worked. "I'm not dismantling anything." "Then what are you doing?" He looked at her for a long, still moment. "I was going to ask you to stay." She heard it like a stone dropped in still water. "As what?" "That's the part I haven't worked out yet," he said. "That's the part I've been terrified to work out, because if I ask you the right thing you might say no." The honesty of it was almost unbearable. "What's the right thing?" she asked, and her voice was quieter now, the armor she wore slightly lower than usual. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, which was enough, and stopped close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes that had deepened over the past 4 months, partly from pain and partly from something else, from the daily effort of trusting someone with what you love. "Adelaide," he said, "I don't want you to work for me. I don't want this to be a job you can resign from." She held very still. "I want you here because you want to be here," he said. "I want this to be yours the same way it's mine. He stopped. His hand came up and then stopped short of touching her, the habit of a reserved man who wasn't sure of his welcome. "I want to know if what I've been feeling these 4 months is one-sided or not. Because if it is, I'll manage. I've managed worse. But I needed you to know I felt it." The barn was very quiet. Outside somewhere, one of the cattle made a low sound and a hawk crossed the wide Montana sky, and the world continued its business without any awareness of what was happening in this particular building. "It is not one-sided," Adelaide said. He let out a breath that had apparently been held for a long time. "I've been cataloging reasons to leave," she said, because she was compelled to be honest even now, especially now. "Every time I notice the feeling getting stronger, I have a system for it. I tell myself I'm temporary, I find the next practical step, I redirect. Has it been working?" "Not particularly," she admitted. He lifted his hand again, and this time let it come to rest gently on her jaw, and she let him because she was done redirecting. He kissed her the way she'd have predicted he'd do most things, with full attention and without any wasted motion. And she kissed him back with 4 months of accumulated certainty that this was, despite all her careful reasoning, exactly where she was supposed to be. When they stepped back from each other, the barn looked the same and everything was different. "I have one condition," she said, because Adelaide Holloway did not surrender her practicality even in moments of profound emotional rearrangement. He smiled, and it was the real one, the one that made him look younger. "Name it. If I stay as a partner, not as an employee, not as someone whose role can be questioned every time you're well enough to feel capable on your own. This is a partnership, equal voice in decisions. My name on the operation in some form that we can agree on." He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "You agreed very quickly," she said. "I've been watching you run this place for 4 months," he said. "I'm not unobservant," she looked at him. "And you're not afraid." "I'm terrified," he said simply. "But I've figured out that I'm more afraid of you leaving than of any of the things I'd have to figure out if you stayed." She considered this. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward the particular gold of late Montana autumn, and the mountains were doing their enormous, indifferent thing, and the ranch was breathing around them, everything in its place. The south herd moved and the winter hay cut and the accounts settled and the fences holding. "All right," she said. "Then I'll stay." The next month was the most interesting of Adelaide's life, and that was saying something. She and Clark worked side by side in a way that was different from the working relationship of the previous 4 months, because now it was explicit, it was mutual. It was 2 people who knew what they were to each other and were still learning the shape of what that meant. There were adjustments. Clark had opinions about things she had developed systems around, and she had opinions about things he had long-standing habits around. And occasionally those opinions collided with a satisfying friction that required negotiation and patience, and the occasional raised voice that ended, each time, in a conclusion neither of them had arrived at alone, and that was better for the collision. He rode with her on the pasture checks, once his shoulder could bear the work without complaint. He was a good horseman in the effortless way of someone who had grown up on horseback, and she was a competent one in the deliberate way of someone who had learned it as a necessary skill and refined it through repetition. She was better than he expected. He was faster than she had anticipated. They found a rhythm on horseback that mirrored the one they were finding everywhere else. In November, the town of Dust Creek had what passed for its social season, a series of church events and a harvest supper at the community hall that Adelaide attended with Clark for the first time as something other than his ranch manager. This was noticed. The town noticed most things. It was small enough that everyone's business was everyone's business, and Clark Keller showing up to the harvest supper with Adelaide Holloway at his side in a way that clearly indicated more than an employment relationship was the kind of development that required discussion. The women of Dust Creek were, on the whole, kind. There were two who were not, specifically, the wife of the bank manager and her particular friend, who seemed to find Adelaide's entire situation vaguely threatening. She ignored them. She had been ignored by experts. Two small-town women with narrow ideas were not her most significant challenge of the year. What she found instead was a community she had not expected to care about. The wives of ranching families, women who understood what it meant to work land, who had their own knowledge and their own quiet competence, who accepted her with the practical warmth of people who recognized a person willing to do the work. The minister's wife, a tall, brisk woman named Frances Aldrich, shook Adelaide's hand at the supper and said, "Clark Keller looks better than he has in 5 years. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." And Adelaide had laughed and felt entirely welcome for the first time in longer than she could easily calculate. Clark asked her to marry him in December, not in any elaborate fashion. He was not, she had learned, an elaborate man. He asked her on the porch of the house in the early evening when the first snow had come in soft and quiet across the ranch, and the light was going pink over the mountains, and it was very cold and she was holding her coffee with both hands. He said, "I'd like you to marry me, if that's something you want." She looked at him. He was watching the snow with an expression of careful composure that she understood immediately was covering up the fact that he was nervous because the composure was too careful and she had learned to read him now. "It is something I want," she said. He looked at her. The composure cracked just enough to show the relief underneath. "Yes. Yes," she confirmed. He nodded, in the way he did when he was absorbing something significant and needed a moment for it. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small oval of pale blue turquoise set in it, and it was not what she would have expected. It was not a diamond or a ruby in the way of conventional gifts, and it was also, she thought with a fullness in her chest that was almost painful, exactly right. "It was my mother's," he said. "She liked turquoise, thought it looked like the sky in spring." Adelaide held out her hand and let him put it on her finger. It fit, which he had accomplished by, she later discovered, measuring a ring she sometimes left on her windowsill and asking Samuel, who had a knowledge of local craftsmen, to verify the sizing with the jeweler in the next town who had made the setting. She had not cried in longer than she could remember. She did not cry now, but it was closer than it had been in years. "Clark," she said. "Yes. I am glad my horse went lame outside Springfield," she said. He looked confused. "What?" "That's how I missed the first train west and ended up on the later one, which is the one that had your advertisement in the newspaper they distributed to the passengers." He looked at her for a moment. Then slowly he smiled the real smile. "Your horse went lame." "At the most inconvenient possible moment," she said. "She is a very good horse and I have since forgiven her completely." He laughed. Out there in the first snow of winter, on his porch, with the mountains going dark and the ranch breathing around them, he laughed, and she stood in it like sunlight. They were married in February 1883, in the Dust Creek Church, in a ceremony that was brief and honest, conducted by the minister whose wife had told Adelaide to keep doing whatever she was doing. The church had 12 pews and all of them were full, because a community that's small shows up for things that matter, and Clark Keller getting married after years of running his ranch alone evidently mattered. Adelaide wore her good blue dress and her mother's hairpins and the turquoise ring. Clark wore his good coat and a clean-shaved face, which, Denny informed her seriously before the ceremony, he had not seen in the past 6 months and was a significant event. Gus, who had spent 3 months deciding what he thought of Adelaide and had arrived at an opinion of considerable warmth, stood up with Clark. Francis Aldrich, who had moved with speed from respectful acquaintance to genuine friend, stood with Adelaide. Samuel and the other hands filled the front pews in their best clothes, and the rest of the town filled the rest. And outside the wind was doing something dramatic with the February cold, but inside it was warm and smelled of candle wax and pine. When it was done, when they were married and the minister had said so, and the small gathering had applauded with the genuine warmth of people who meant it, Clark took her hand and held it with a steadiness that said everything he did not put into elaborate words. She had been running this ranch for 8 months. She would be running it for the rest of her life, but now it would be running it as herself, fully and without qualification, as Adelaide Keller, which was a name she tried on in the privacy of her own mind and found it fit. The spring of 1883 brought changes to the ranch that were both practical and personal. Practically, Adelaide oversaw the expansion of the breeding operation, negotiating with a rancher 2 counties over for the introduction of new bloodlines into the herd that improved the overall quality significantly. She also established a formal annual contract with the Helena beef buyers that eliminated the year-to-year uncertainty of finding good prices at the right time. Clark handled the land and the men and the physical operation with a renewed energy that his recovery had given him, and the combination of his on-the-ground knowledge and her management and planning created something that people in Dust Creek began to notice and talk about in the appreciative way of a community watching something succeed. Personally, she was pregnant by April. She told Clark on a Tuesday morning with the directness she brought to everything, "I believe we should expect an addition to the ranch household in November." He had set down his coffee cup very carefully. Then he had looked at her with an expression she had no existing category for, something vast and bright and slightly terrified and deeply glad. "November," he said. "Approximately," she said. "Doc Reinhardt can be more precise." He stood up and came around the table and held her in the way he had, which was thorough and quiet and warm, and she let him, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. "I'm going to need to adjust the morning pasture schedule for a few months, and I'll need you to handle the north fence inspection next week since the terrain is rough. But I am well." She felt him laugh quietly against her hair. "Of course," he said, "the pasture schedule. I am capable of experiencing multiple things simultaneously," she said without lifting her head. "I know," he said. "That's one of approximately 40 things I love about you." She was quiet for a moment. "Have you counted them, the 40 things?" "Running count," he said. "It keeps going up." The summer of that year was the best she had ever known, not because it was easy. Running a cattle ranch while pregnant in 1883 in Montana was not easy, and she did not pretend it was. There were mornings that required more effort than she was accustomed to, and afternoons when she was tired in a way that was new and inconvenient, and she had to accept help with things she would have managed alone before, which was, she discovered, its own form of growth. But the ranch was humming. The new breeding program was showing early results. The expanded account with the Helena buyers meant their financial position was the most stable it had been in over a decade. Samuel Bridger, promoted by her to head of the land and fence operations, was doing work that would have taken 2 men before, and he was training Denny with a patience that was producing results. Holt and Rafe were consistent and loyal, and Clark was himself, which she had come to understand was a very considerable thing. He was present in the way that some men are not, fully present in the work and in the house and in the life they were building. He was learning to voice things that he felt, slowly and with evident effort, because he was a private man and expression did not come easily, but he was learning because she valued it and he valued her. He told her things about the ranch, about the land, about his father and the years of building this place from a smaller property to what it had grown to be. She listened and asked questions and took the history in, because the history of a place is part of the place, and this was her place now, and she wanted all of it. She told him things she had not told anyone else for a long time, about her mother, who had died when Adelaide was 11, and about what it was like to grow up knowing that you were capable of things that the world around you was not going to hand you space to do. About Garrison Prout, who had been a good employer and a fair man, and who had still replaced her with his son without a second thought, because that was simply how the world worked. About the moment she had read Clark's advertisement and felt, for the first time in years, that the world might occasionally work in an interesting direction. He listened to all of it. "I used to wonder," she said one evening in August, sitting on the porch in the long Montana twilight with her coffee in hand, "if I was asking for too much, just wanting to do the work and be acknowledged for it." "That's not asking for too much," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I've known it for a while. It took coming here to know it without reservation." He reached over and took her hand. "I'm glad you came," he said. "So am I," she said. "Though I want it on record that your advertisement was minimally informative and somewhat misleading about the extent of the work required." "Noted," he said, with the near smile that she had, months ago, considered dangerous to her equilibrium and had since resigned herself to entirely. Their son was born on the 4th of November, 1883. She had insisted on having the Dust Creek doctor in attendance rather than relying solely on the midwife, because she was a practical woman who saw no reason to not have every available competent person present. Doc Reinhardt and Mrs. Cole, the midwife, worked together with practiced efficiency, and Clark sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in a state that Denny, who had brought coffee up from the kitchen, described later to Gus as the most scared I've ever seen a man who wasn't actually in danger. The baby was healthy and strong and announced himself with a volume that carried through the closed door and down the stairs. Clark was allowed in, and he sat on the edge of the bed and held his son with the concentrated care of someone holding the most important thing in the world. And Adelaide watched him and felt the fullness in her chest reach a depth she had not previously known existed. "He needs a name," she said. "I thought," Clark said without looking up from the baby, "Thomas, after my father." Adelaide considered it. Thomas Keller, it had weight to it, it had history. "Thomas," she agreed. "Thomas Clark Keller." Clark looked up at that. "Clark for the middle. He should have something from each side," she said. "It's sensible." His expression went through several things at once, landed on something she could only describe as overwhelmed in the best possible sense. "Thomas Clark Keller," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. The winter that followed was the warmest she had spent in years, despite being in Montana. Thomas Clark Keller was a vigorous baby who had, Adelaide felt, inherited the best qualities of both his parents in a combination that was going to be either extraordinary or deeply exhausting. He was, from his first weeks, a determined, alert, interested small person who studied his surroundings with a concentration that reminded her of Clark working through a problem and made her laugh to herself when she noticed it. Clark was, without ceremony or self-consciousness, a devoted father. He held the baby with competence rather than anxiety, and he talked to Thomas in the matter-of-fact way he talked about the ranch, explaining the operations of things, the daily schedule, the accounts, the cattle, as though the infant were a new hand being oriented. Adelaide found this so deeply characteristic of him that it filled her with a tenderness she could not have articulated to anyone and felt no need to. By spring of 1884, she was back at full operational capacity, which she had largely maintained through the winter with adjustments. Thomas had, to his credit, been a relatively cooperative sleeper, and had taken to a schedule with an adaptability she privately felt was a very good sign of his fundamental character. Garrett Locke appeared again in April. She had not quite forgotten about him, because she was not a woman who forgot potential complications, and she had been correct that he had not given up. He arrived this time with a letter from his consortium that had attached to it a formal offer, printed on heavy paper and smelling of Eastern money, with a dollar figure that was, she would be honest, considerably more than the ranch's previous offers. Clark read it. Then he handed it to her. She read it. Then she set it on the table between them. "You've made this ranch worth twice what it was 18 months ago," Clark said. "We've made it worth that," she corrected. He nodded. "The offer is real." "It is," she agreed. "Do you want to sell?" He looked at her. "Do you?" She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about Thomas in his crib upstairs, and the North Meadow hay, and Samuel's careful work on the fences, and Denny's steady growth into something like a real cowhand, and Gus's 12 years in this land, and the church in Dust Creek and Francis Aldrich, and her own roots that had gone down into this Montana soil in ways she had not fully comprehended until she imagined pulling them up. "No," she said. "Then no," said Clark. She wrote to Locke that afternoon, clearly and without excessive elaboration, thanking him for the offer and informing him that the Keller ranch was not for sale, and that they did not anticipate a change in that position. He wrote back once, a final attempt, slightly more aggressive in its framing. Adelaide read it and filed it in the wastebasket. Clark caught her doing this and asked what she was filing. "The future of that conversation," she said. He smiled and went back to the accounts she had been teaching him to keep in her particular system, which he had resisted initially and had come to respect over months of seeing how clearly it illuminated the financial position of the ranch. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that stressed the whole region, and the summer of 1885 brought flooding that took out 3 sections of the south fence and gave Samuel 6 weeks of complicated repair work. The autumn of 1885 was when Gus, at 63, told her quietly one morning that his back had made a decision about what he could still do, and that decision did not include another Montana winter on a working cattle ranch. She sat with him on the fence railing in the early morning light and listened to him talk about a daughter in Oregon and a modest piece of land there, and she felt the particular sadness of seeing someone leave a place they've been long enough to be part of it. She organized a farewell supper that drew more people than she expected, because Gus, quiet and methodical as he was, had become, over his years at the ranch, a fixed point that people relied on without always realizing it. He cried exactly once briefly, when he shook Clark's hand, and then composed himself with a dignity that she deeply respected. She hired his replacement with care, choosing a man named Peter Vance, recommended by a ranching family 1 county over, who was 42 and experienced and steady, and who took to Samuel's operation with the ease of someone who understood what good leadership looked like. Life on the Keller ranch had a rhythm that she had come to love, the way she loved the particular quality of the Montana light in autumn, the way it turned everything gold and particular, the way you knew you were exactly where you were and nowhere else. By 1886, Thomas was 2 years old and had strong opinions about most things, which his father found highly amusing and his mother found entirely recognizable. She was also, by the autumn of that year, expecting again, which she confirmed to Clark on a Wednesday with the same directness as the first time. He had not set down his coffee quite as carefully this time. "Another November?" he asked. "June," she said. "Give or take." He stood up from the table and kissed her in the middle of the kitchen, with Thomas observing from his chair with 2-year-old curiosity, and she laughed into it, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the morning fire, and outside the Montana morning was being enormous and gold. Their daughter arrived in June 1887, small and fierce, and apparently fully aware from her first moments that she had things to say about everything. They named her Catherine Adelaide Keller, Catherine for Clark's mother and Adelaide for herself, which was Clark's insistence, and which she accepted with less argument than usual. Thomas, at 3 years old, regarded his sister with the careful consideration of someone not yet certain whether this development was positive. By the end of her first month, he had concluded it was, largely because she looked at him with a focused attention that he interpreted, correctly, as admiration. The ranch in 1887 was a different thing from what she had found in 1882. It was not that the land had changed. Montana land does not change quickly. The mountains were the same, and the sky was the same, and the grass went gold in summer and white in winter, and the cattle moved through it with the slow purpose of cattle everywhere. But the operation had been rebuilt from the foundation. The herd was stronger, the systems were reliable, the accounts were clear and healthy, the relationships with buyers were formalized and stable, the land itself was better managed than it had been in years. She had brought in, over 4 years, improvements to the water systems that drew from the expertise Samuel had contributed, a small grain storage structure that reduced their feed costs, and a formalized rotation of the grazing land that was extending its productive capacity. Clark was part of all of it. He was not a figurehead. He worked the land with his hands and his body and his knowledge that went down to the bones of this place, and she managed the operation with her systems and her accounting and her relentless, practical intelligence, and between them they had made something worth keeping. She sometimes thought, when she was very honest with herself, about the moment in the barn when she had thought he was taking it back. When she had felt the floor tilt under her and had prepared herself for the loss of something she had not known she needed, she thought about the fact that she had almost walked away. She thought about what she would have missed. The children, of course. Thomas and Catherine, who were becoming themselves with the particular speed and specificity of children. Thomas already showing a quiet aptitude for the land that made Clark watch him, sometimes with a look of careful, wondering pride, and Catherine already showing a verbal confidence, and a curiosity about absolutely everything that made Adelaide feel she was looking at a mirror of herself at that age and feel, for the first time, entirely glad of what she saw. But also the morning pasture, rides with Clark in the summer light. Also the evenings on the porch when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and they talked about the day and the plans and sometimes nothing important at all. Also the particular feeling of being known, fully and without reservation, by another person, of having your capabilities acknowledged not as remarkable but as simply yours, as the natural fact of who you are. She had not known she was lonely before coming to Montana. She had been too busy to know it, and too practical to indulge it. She knew now, because the knowing of it meant the loneliness was gone. In the spring of 1888, a drought warning arrived from the territory offices, and she spent 6 weeks before the dry season reorganizing the water management plan, with Samuel and implementing emergency grazing rotations that would, if the drought materialized as predicted, minimize the loss to the herd. The drought was severe. It came in July and stayed through September and turned the grass to pale gold and the water sources to slow, difficult things. They lost 11 head, which was not nothing, but it was manageable, and the neighboring ranches lost considerably more because they had not planned for it. The Massey Ranch, which had never been friendly to the Kellers, lost nearly 40 head and came to Clark, quietly and with evident difficulty, asking about the possibility of running some of their surviving cattle on Keller land through the worst of it in exchange for payment. She and Clark discussed it that evening. "They've never done us any favors," Clark said. "No," she agreed, "but their cattle didn't make that decision." He was quiet for a moment. "How much of the north pasture can we spare?" "Enough for 60 head, possibly 70, if we pull our north herd back to the upper meadow and ration the water source carefully." "Samuel, I've already asked him to assess it." "He thinks it's possible." Clark looked at her. "You expected me to say yes. I expected you to be the man I married, she said, which meant yes was the probable outcome. He made the near smile. We should charge them properly for it. I have a rate in mind, she said. Of course you do. The Massey cattle came to Keller land for 8 weeks. They were managed well, because Adelaide Holloway Keller did not do things badly regardless of the circumstances, and Samuel's careful oversight kept the arrangement from disrupting the Keller herd significantly. The payment arrived on time and in full, and as a secondary outcome, the Massey family's attitude toward the Kellers became notably less hostile, a development that Clark noted was probably worth more in the long term than the payment. Autumn 1888 was a good one. The drought broke in October and the grass came back and the herd recovered quickly, and the accounts at year's end showed the strongest position the ranch had seen since Clark's father's time, which he mentioned to her one evening with a quiet satisfaction that she understood exactly. Your father would be pleased, she said. He'd have liked you, Clark said. He was a practical man. You say that as though it's my primary quality. It's your most visible quality, he said. The others take longer to find. And how long did it take you, she asked. He considered this. I saw the other ones in the barn, he said. The first time we talked, the way you gave me the information I needed without making me feel like a patient being given a diagnosis, that takes something more than practicality. She thought about the first days. The parlor table and the map and the careful negotiation of a working relationship with a man who was furious about being still. You were difficult, she said. I was, he agreed. I liked you anyway, she said. That was inconvenient, he laughed. When did you admit it to yourself? She thought about this honestly. The North Meadow, she said. When Samuel and I identified the hay-cutting sites, I thought Clark will want to know how we found this, and I was already thinking about the way you'd respond, the way your face does the thing it does when you're absorbing something you find interesting. And then I thought that's not a professional observation. The North Meadow, he repeated. The hay sites, she confirmed. I fell for you approximately 3 days earlier than that, he said. She looked at him. When? The morning you were in the south pasture before dawn and I could see you from the window going over the fence line in the early light. You were moving like you owned the place. I was the manager, she said. Technically, I was operating it. You weren't managing it, he said. You were caring for it. There's a difference. And I watched you do it and thought that this woman is going to change everything, and I didn't know then how right I was. The room was warm with the autumn fire and quiet with the sleeping children upstairs, and she looked at Clark Keller across the table in his house that was hers too, and felt the truth of everything they had built land on her with a completeness that was not soft but solid, like good fencing, like well-cut hay, like a barn that was built by someone who meant it to last. We should go to bed, she said. Yes, he agreed. After you tell me what 41 is, she said. He looked confused for a moment and then remembered. The running count. You said 40 in the barn, what's 41? He thought about it. The way you negotiate, he said. Not the skill, the enjoyment. The way you enjoy it when you have to be precise and the other person doesn't expect precision, she smiled. That is a very specific observation. I've been paying attention, he said. So have I, she said. Would you like to know your count? He looked at her with something warm and curious. There's a count. I have always been good with numbers, she said. She told him 17 of them, because 17 was enough for a Tuesday evening in autumn 1888, and saved the rest for another time because she was practical, and there was plenty of time, and she had no intention of going anywhere. The Keller ranch continued. Thomas Clark Keller grew into a boy who was equally comfortable on horseback and at the account books, who had his mother's precision and his father's patience, and who, at 7 years old, was already asking Samuel questions about the land that Samuel answered seriously and with respect, because the boy deserved it. Catherine Adelaide Keller grew into a girl who had strong opinions about every aspect of ranch operations, and who had decided, by age 4, that she would one day be in charge of the cattle breeding program. having apparently identified this as the area of the operation with the most interesting complexity. Adelaide regarded this ambition with entirely undisguised pride, and Clark regarded it with a fond helplessness that she found endearing. There was a morning in the spring of 1890 when she stood on the porch of the Keller house, which was now the Adelaide and Clark Keller house, which was the house that Thomas and Catherine filled with noise and questions, and the specific chaos of children who had been encouraged to be curious about everything, and looked out at the ranch in the early light. The fences were holding. The south herd was visible in the far pasture, moving with the easy purpose of cattle that were well managed. The barn, the one Clark had built at 24 with most of a summer, was standing solid in the new spring light. The mountains were there, enormous and permanent and indifferent in the way that the best things are. Denny came around the side of the barn, nearly 25 now, a real cowhand who had grown into himself under the combined influences of Samuel's teaching and Adelaide's insistence on quality work. He touched his hat to her as he passed. Samuel was already in the north pasture, she knew, because Samuel was always already in the north pasture at this hour. Peter Vance and two newer hands she'd hired the previous year were bringing the horses from the paddock for the morning's work. Clark came out of the house behind her, coffee in both hands, and stood beside her. He looked the same as always, slightly more silver at the temples now, and he still hadn't managed to stay clean-shaved for more than 2 weeks at a stretch, and he looked at the ranch in the morning light the way she had first seen him look at it from the window when he was still recovering, with the love of a person for a thing they have made and cannot stop making. He handed her one of the coffees. She took it. "Thomas wants to ride with Samuel today," he said. "I know." I told him yes. Samuel knows he's coming. Catherine wants to come with me to look at the new breeding records. She's been asking about the bloodline documentation for a week, Adelaide said. She should see it. She retains everything. She does, he said, with pride so unguarded it would have been visible from the road. They stood in the morning and drank their coffee and looked at the ranch. 8 years, he said. Almost to the month, she agreed. Adelaide, Clark. I'm still afraid, he said. She looked at him. Of what now? Of the ordinary fear, he said. That it won't last, that something will take it. Something might, she said honestly, because she was Adelaide Holloway Keller and she did not offer comfortable untruths. The drought might come back, the markets might shift, something we haven't planned for might arrive. Yes, he said. But, she said, and turned to face him with the full weight of everything she knew and felt and believed, we have built something real here. Built it from work and honesty and the decision made by both of us to stay when it was easier to leave. That doesn't dissolve. Whatever happens to it, it was real, and I intend to be here for whatever is next. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his coffee cup on the porch railing, and he kissed her in the morning light with the ease and fullness of a man who has been doing something long enough that it is the most natural thing in the world. And she kissed him back with the certainty of a woman who arrived with a trunk and a plan and found something better than she'd planned for. Behind the closed door of the house, Catherine's voice rose sharply, and Thomas's lower voice rose in response, and something fell off a shelf with a significant crash. They broke apart and looked at each other. "I'll go," Adelaide said. "I'll finish the coffee," Clark said. She went back into the house of which she was half owner and fully herself, and sorted out whatever had precipitated the crash with the efficient practicality that was her first and finest quality. And the morning continued, and the ranch continued, and the mountains continued, and the life they had made from need and capability and unexpected love continued in the way of all truly built things, solid and unafraid and wholly, perfectly, irreversibly theirs.